All right, diving in today, folks, we've got a request, a listener's pick. We're taking on Spinoza.
Spinoza.
Oh, yeah. Always a good time.
We are going deep on his theory of attributes, and our trusty guide is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on the topic. For anyone out there, grappling with metaphysics, Spinoza is just one of those figures you can't ignore.
Absolutely. Attributes are, well, they're really at the heart of it all for him.
His whole system hinges on them, one substance.
Right. One substance, God or nature.
And it's the attributes that make that substance, well, not just this bland, formless thing.
They're what give it its character, its expression, in a way.
They're how the one becomes many, how we get this incredible diversity within this unified reality.
Mm.
But even for seasoned philosophers,
Even for the pros.
Spinoza's attributes can be, well, a bit of a head-scratcher, right? There's a surprising amount of debate.
It's true. You'd think there'd be more agreement on such a central concept, but the scholarship is surprisingly, well, lively. So today's mission for you, our fellow philosophy enthusiast, is to really get a grip on this theory.
Demystified.
Exactly. We're going to start with the basics. What are attributes in Spinoza's world?
The building blocks.
Then we'll explore those tricky interpretative disagreements.
The forks in the road, the different paths through the forest.
And finally, we'll see how those different readings affect our understanding of other key Spinozistic doctrines.
The ripple effects.
So let's unpack this. What exactly constitutes an attribute for Spinoza? Where do we even begin with this?
Well, to really understand Spinoza, you've got to go back to, well, his philosophical roots. We need to talk about Descartes.
Descartes. Ah, the OG.
Yeah, Spinoza was constantly, in dialogue with Descartes. Agreeing, disagreeing, but always wrestling with those Cartesian ideas.
Right, setting the stage, as they say. So Descartes and attributes, refresh us. What was the deal there?
All right, so for Descartes, an attribute was it was the defining essence of a thing. So for the mind.
Thinking, right.
Exactly. Thought. That was its core, its essence, all those mental activities, that's thought. And for the body.
Well, I guess being physical, taking up space.
You got it, extension. That's the essence of body for Descartes, just being spread out in 3 dimensions. Remember that famous wax example?
Oh, the wax from the Meditations, yeah.
The wax. It melts, it changes shape, loses its scent, its texture. Everything seems to change. But what remains?
That it still is, somewhere. It takes up space.
Exactly. It's still extended. That's its fundamental nature, according to Descartes. And for him, these two things, mind and body, defined by thought and extension.
Two different kinds of stuff.
Right. They were really distinct, created substances. They could exist independently, at least in theory.
Like separate entities, aside from God.
That's right. Both dependent on God, of course, as the creator.
Yeah.
But fundamentally different kinds of being. Now, this is where Spinoza takes a pretty radical turn.
A sharp left where Descartes went right. Okay, lay it on us.
Spinoza, he agrees with Descartes on a couple of key points. Thought and extension, their attributes, he's on board with that. And he agrees they're really distinct, although what that means for him is a bit different, as we'll see. But then he just throws this massive wrench in the works.
I sense a but coming.
But Spinoza completely rejects the idea of created substances. No separate mental and physical things. For him, there's only one substance, infinite, and he calls it God or nature.
Okay, hold on. So instead of thought being the defining feature of some separate mental thing and extension the defining feature of some separate physical thing, Spinoza's saying they're both just attributes of this one big substance.
Exactly. One substance, God or nature, and thought and extension are just two of its many attributes.
It's like he's simplifying things, but then also making it way more complicated.
Right. How can this one thing have these seemingly opposite characteristics? Well, that's where his formal definition of attribute comes in.
All right, hit us with the definition, straight from the source.
Straight from the Ethics, definition 4, Spinoza says, by attribute, I understand what the intellect perceives of substance as constituting its essence.
What the intellect perceives. Okay, right off the bat, we've got some questions.
It wouldn't be Spinoza without a few questions.
Whose intellect are we talking about here? Mine, yours, some superhuman intellect, and then as constituting its essence. That as seems slippery. Like, does it mean it actually constitutes its essence, or just that our intellect perceives it that way?
You've hit the nail on the head. Those are the million-dollar questions, the ambiguities that have been fueling Spinoza's scholarship for, well, centuries. Is the perceiver finite or infinite? And is that perception a subjective take, or is it reflecting something objectively real?
So how you answer those questions determines how you interpret Spinoza's whole theory of attributes.
It's the foundation.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. Let's move on to another key concept, this idea of real distinction. Descartes used it to argue for the separation of mind and body as distinct substances. Where does Spinoza land on this?
This is a classic Spinoza move, taking a term from Descartes and giving it a whole new spin. So in the Scholium to Proposition 10 of Part 1, he says that, yeah, attributes can be conceived as really distinct, meaning we can think about one without necessarily thinking about the other.
Like, I can think about thinking without necessarily thinking about my physical body.
Exactly. But Spinoza says we can't jump from that to the conclusion that they're separate things, separate substances.
So just because I can conceive of them separately doesn't mean they actually exist separately.
Right. And this directly challenges Descartes, for whom this clear and distinct conceivability was proof of their separate existence. For Spinoza, the fact that thought and extension can be conceived independently, it just means that they're different ways of understanding the same underlying reality, the one substance.
So real distinction for Spinoza is about conceptual independence, not ontological separation.
You got it. It's a difference in how we grasp reality, not a difference in reality itself. And this leads to a very important principle, the principle of no cross-attribute causation.
No cross-attribute causation. What does that mean exactly?
It means that the mind can't cause the body to do anything, and the body can't cause the mind to do anything.
Like my desire to move my arm doesn't directly cause the physical movement.
Right. Instead, that mental event, the desire, and the physical event, the arm moving, they're both just expressions of the same underlying event in the one substance, just under different attributes.
Interesting. So no Cartesian mind-body interaction problem.
Exactly. Each attribute operates within its own sphere, its own domain. There's no causal crossing over.
This is getting pretty dense. Now, the entry also mentions that Spinoza seems to, in some passages, identify God with his attributes. How does that square with the idea that they're distinct, even if not separate?
Right. There are places where he uses this Latin word "passive," which means, or what is the same. So he'll talk about substance and then say something like, or what is the same, its attributes, like they're interchangeable.
But how can something be both one and many at the same time?
That's the million-dollar question. The degree and manner of this identification, well, it's hotly debated in Spinoza's scholarship. If substance is identical to each attribute, then wouldn't the attributes have to be identical to each other?
Which would contradict the whole really distinct thing.
Exactly. It's a puzzle, and different interpretations offer different solutions, as we'll see.
Okay, lots to ponder there. Let's focus on one of these key attributes for a minute. Extension. Descartes saw it as the defining characteristic of created physical stuff. How does Spinoza elevate it to a divine attribute?
This is where Spinoza really breaks away from Descartes. He takes this attribute that was confined to the finite realm and makes it a fundamental aspect of the infinite. And he does it very carefully, step by step, in Part 1 of the Ethics.
Walk us through it.
He starts by defining God as a substance with infinite attributes. Then he establishes that substances can't share attributes and that every substance has to be infinite. But there can only be one substance, right?
Right, setting the stage for one being with many ways of being.
Exactly. And he goes on to argue that no attribute can imply divisibility, because an absolutely infinite substance can't be divided.
So no chopped up God.
Right. And finally, he concludes that everything that exists is in God. So with all that groundwork laid, he can then say that extension as a genuine attribute has to belong to this one indivisible, infinite being.
But wait, isn't extension by its very nature divisible? Like I can take any physical object and divide it into smaller parts.
That's a very common objection.
Yeah.
And Spinoza addresses it head-on in the Scholium to Proposition 15. He says that the divisibility we see in things applies to what he calls modes of extension, not to extension itself.
So like I can divide a volume of water into drops, but the water itself doesn't become less watery.
Exactly. Individual bodies, they're just modes, temporary modifications of the attribute of extension, which itself belongs to the one substance.
Okay, so thought and extension are both divine attributes. Now let's tackle this famous 2p7 doctrine, as our entry calls it. The order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. That seems super important for understanding Spinoza's take on the mind-body relationship.
It's the core of his parallelism. Although, it's important to note, Spinoza never used that term himself. What he's saying is that there's this perfect one-to-one correspondence between the mental realm and the physical realm.
The circle example in the scholium really illustrates this, right?
Absolutely. Spinoza says that a circle in nature under the attribute of extension and the idea of that circle in the mind under the attribute of thought, they're not two separate things. They're the same thing, just conceived under different attributes.
So my thought about my body and my actual body, they're not two separate things interacting, but rather two ways of understanding the same underlying reality.
Exactly. And this mirroring, this correspondence, it applies to everything, not just circles. Every cause and effect in the physical world has a corresponding cause and effect in the mental world. It's like two sides of the same coin.
This seems to sidestep the whole mind-body interaction problem.
It does. If mind and body are just two aspects of the same thing,
Yeah.
there's no need to explain how they interact, because they're not really interacting. They're just unfolding in parallel.
Elegant solution if it works. Now, Spinoza says there are infinitely many attributes, but we humans only seem to have access to two, thought and extension. Why the limitation?
This is another one of those questions that gets at the heart of Spinoza's system. He says our human minds, they're just not equipped to grasp the full range of God's attributes.
We're playing on easy mode, basically.
Kinda, yeah. It's like we're only seeing a tiny sliver of the whole picture.
And he gives a more detailed explanation in letter 64, right?
He does. He says that our understanding is determined by the idea of our body. And since our body is a mode of extension, our knowledge is limited to the attributes of thought and extension.
So our embodiment shapes our knowing.
Exactly. We're stuck in the thought extension loop.
But as our entry points out, not everyone's convinced by this explanation.
Right. Some scholars, like Bennett, they find it a bit ad hoc. Like, why should our mind's connection to our body limit us to just these two attributes out of infinitely many?
Good point. Okay, so we've covered the basics. Now let's get to the fun part, the interpretative disagreements. The entry lays out two main camps, the subjectivists and the objectivists. Let's start with the subjectivists.
The subjectivists, they emphasize the role of the finite human intellect in how we understand attributes. They take their cue from Hegel.
Hegel, another heavyweight.
Yeah, Hegel saw Spinoza's substance as this ultimate undifferentiated reality. And he thought attributes were just our way, our limited way of trying to grasp this reality.
So for the subjectivists, attributes are more about how we think about God, not necessarily about how God is.
Exactly. They're projections, constructs of our minds that, as in Spinoza's definition, they read it as if, like we perceive the substance as if it had these attributes, but that doesn't necessarily mean it actually does.
Okay, so subjectivism is all about the limitations of our understanding.
It's about recognizing that our perspective shapes our perception of reality.
But the entry also mentions some serious objections to this view.
Yeah, if attributes are just our projections, then how can we ever have genuine knowledge of God?
Wouldn't it all be kind of, well, made up?
Right. And that seems to contradict Spinoza's own insistence that we can have true knowledge of God.
Plus, if attributes are just mental constructs, how can they be identical to God, as Spinoza sometimes claims?
Exactly. It's a tough position to defend. And as a result, subjectivism has kind of fallen out of favor in recent Spinoza scholarship.
So objectivism is the more popular view these days.
It is. Objectivists, they start from the idea that our knowledge of God through attributes has to be true, accurate.
More realist, less about our subjective limitations.
Right, and they often interpret the intellect, in Spinoza's definition, as referring to the infinite intellect, God's intellect. So attributes are what God perceives as constituting his essence.
So for the objectivists, attributes are real objective features of God.
Exactly. They're not just our projections. And this means that the real distinction between attributes has to be grounded in God's nature, not just in our minds.
But then we're back to that problem of how one substance can have multiple distinct attributes without being, well, multiple things.
It's a challenge, and different objectivists have different ways of addressing it.
Like Bennett's idea that the distinction between substance and attribute might be empty.
Yeah, Bennett, he argues that the distinction is more conceptual than ontological. It's about how we think about things, not necessarily about how things actually are.
So for Bennett, it's more like saying extension is extended than saying substance has extension.
Kind of, yeah. He thinks the idea of a separate substance, behind or beyond its attributes, it doesn't really add anything.
Interesting. So that's one way to reconcile the unity and multiplicity.
There are others, too. Some suggest the distinction is merely rational, meaning it exists only in our minds, not in reality.
So in reality, substance and attribute are one and the same.
Exactly. It's just our way of thinking that separates them.
Lots of different options on the table. Now, these different interpretations, they have big implications for how we understand other aspects of Spinoza's philosophy, right? Starting with the question of how many attributes there are.
Right. Spinoza says there's an infinity of attributes, but what kind of infinity?
Numerical infinity, like an endless number, or just a complete set.
That's the debate.
Yeah.
Bennett, he leans towards the complete set idea. He thinks maybe there are only the two we know, thought and extension.
But there are other passages that suggest Spinoza meant a numerical infinity, right?
Right, passages where he talks about a substance consisting of an infinity of attributes, or mentions any other attribute.
So, still up for debate.
Definitely. And how you interpret intellect in Spinoza's definition influences how you read those passages. If it's God's intellect, then there's no reason to limit the number of attributes.
Okay, what about the 2p7 doctrine, that mind-body parallelism? Does the number of attributes affect how we understand that?
Absolutely. If there are only two attributes, then the parallelism is pretty straightforward. Every mode of thought has a corresponding mode of extension, and vice versa.
Two parallel tracks, perfectly aligned.
But if there are more than two, things get more complicated.
Like, how do all these other attributes fit into the picture?
Right. Some scholars, like Curley and Melamed, they suggest that thought might have a special status. Maybe it encompasses ideas of all the modes, even those under attributes we don't know.
So thought is like the master attribute, reflecting everything else.
It's one possibility. Another idea is that attributes come in pairs, like thought and extension, but then maybe there's another pair and so on, infinitely.
Mind-boggling.
It's pretty complex, yeah.
Okay, let's go back to the identification of substance and attributes. How do the subjectivists and objectivists handle this?
Well, as we said, strict identity between substance and any single attribute seems to lead to problems.
Because then all the attributes would have to be identical to each other.
Exactly. So the subjectivists, they don't really have a problem here because they don't think attributes are objectively real anyway.
They're just our projections, so no need for them to be identical to the substance.
Right. But for the objectivists, it's trickier.
Because they think attributes are real, objective features of God.
Exactly. So Curley, he proposes that the identity is between substance and the totality of attributes.
Like substance is the sum total of all its attributes?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
And Bennett, he thinks Spinoza might be exaggerating when he talks about identity.
Maybe it's more of a close relationship than strict identity.
That's his take. But the idea of strict identity works best if you accept that the distinction between substance and attribute is just rational.
Meaning it's a distinction in our minds, not in reality.
Right. So knowing an attribute is knowing the substance, just under a particular aspect.
Makes sense. Okay, last but not least, how do all these different interpretations affect how we understand the union of mind and body?
Well, for Descartes, the problem was how two separate substances, mind and body, could interact. For Spinoza, it's about how two modes, one of thought and one of extension, can be one and the same thing.
Two sides of the same coin, as we said.
Exactly. And this isn't such a big problem for the subjectivist, because they don't think the distinction between attributes is that fundamental.
But for the objectivists, it's a bigger challenge.
Definitely. They've proposed all sorts of solutions. Some appeal to attribute neutral properties, some to shared neutral properties, some to an underlying chain of events that's expressed in both thought and extension.
But all those solutions have a problem, right?
Yeah, if substance has to be conceived under some attribute, as Spinoza says, then anything that's completely independent of attributes would be unknowable to us.
So we're back to that problem of unknowability.
It keeps popping up. The alternative, again, is to say that the distinction between attributes is just rational.
A distinction in our minds, not in reality.
Right, so the union of mind and body is just the unity of a single mode that we apprehend through two different, but ultimately unified, attributive frameworks.
This is getting deep, even for us. Now, before we wrap up, the entry briefly mentions Spinoza's short treatise. How does his treatment of attributes there compare to the ethics?
The short treatise is an earlier work, and it's less developed, but you can see some of the seeds of the ethics there. He talks about thought and extension, and he gives them a special status, but he also talks about these other divine attributes like omnipotence and eternality.
The classic God stuff.
Right, but instead of just rejecting them, he calls them propria. They're characteristics that belong to God, but they don't reveal his essence in the same way that thought and extension do.
So they tell us that God is, but not what God is.
Exactly. In the ethics, He pretty much drops this whole idea of propria. It's like he realized that thought and extension were the real keys to understanding God's nature.
So the ethics is a more streamlined, focused work.
It is.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive, folks. Spinoza's theory of attributes, it's complex, it's challenging, but it's also incredibly rewarding. These attributes, they're not just some sideshow, they're at the very heart of his whole system.
They're how he bridges the gap between the one and many, between the unity of substance and the diversity of experience.
And the fact that there's still so much debate about how to interpret them, it just shows how rich and relevant Spinoza's ideas are, even today.
Absolutely. He's still making us think centuries later.
So to you, our philosophically minded listener, as you continue to grapple with Spinoza, remember those two big interpretive frameworks, subjectivism and objectivism, that color everything.
They're the lenses through which we read Spinoza.
And as you delve deeper, ask yourself, which lens feels more natural to you? Which one resonates with your own philosophical intuitions?
It's a question worth pondering.
Because how you answer that question, it might reveal something about your own underlying assumptions about the nature of reality.
It's all connected.
We encourage you to explore Spinoza's ethics for yourself. It's a challenging but ultimately enriching journey.
And don't be afraid to get lost in the debates, the disagreements, the different perspectives. That's where the real philosophical fun begins.
Until next time, happy philosophizing.
Keep those minds sharp.